So now we're going to get into the class balance. And again, I don't know anything about the other classes. All I play is the Necromancer. And the reason why I only play the Necromancer is because they change so much about the Necromancer every single patch that it requires an entire person's like full career of just covering this one class to be able to stay up to date. There's a lot in here. I'm going to try to truncate it down to as much as I can, and the impact of these things as much as I can, so you can walk away understanding it without being completely overwhelmed here. But just in the top, we have a bunch of generic changes that affect what type of affixes are available on gear. So they took all of the different thorns types. So skeletal warriors, mages, and golems inherit an amount of thorns and made it a single affix. Minions now inherit a larger percentage of your thorns. So that's cool. It cuts down 2 affixes. These are things that could spawn on rings, which was really annoying. Seeing a ring that has like mage thorns and golem thorns and then essence and vulnerable damage. And you're like, well, these stats are effectively crap. So just even that change right there makes it so that rings are just going to roll better stats more often. They added a new affix, which is minions inherit critical strike chance. This is similar to the Thorns one, where they would previously inherit 30% of your crit chance, whereas now they can inherit a larger percentage of your critical strike chance, meaning that they're more likely to crit. I don't think that this is super valuable. We can now get cooldown reduction on shields. This is something that you previously could only get on focuses. So being able to put this on shields now means it's not as diminishing of an overall effectiveness for some builds. So that's really nice. So being able to get like maximum life and cooldown reduction on your shield with your all resistance on your shield now, you can start building into a lot of stats that you just couldn't previously to be able to help out a lot of different builds. And now blood orbs naturally heal your minions for a percentage of your maximum life as well. They've changed a lot of the different blood passives. So this is being put in place to be able to mitigate some of that loss in the healing that's going to be available later. One of the changes that I had recommended for Army of the Dead, just bare minimum, was that every single time that a corpse explodes, it should leave behind a corpse. They implemented that. I'm not going to say that I'm responsible for it, but this was something that was like bare minimum what was necessary. I still don't think that Army of the Dead is somehow now magically a really good skill, but bare minimum at least actively fills a utility spot that none of your other ultimate skills do, and goes further to pretty drastically increase the quality of life of pure minion builds, especially if they're looking to be outside of the Mendeln, generic build path. On top of that, they've changed all of our fortify abilities to now fortify for maximum health as opposed to fortifying for base health. Increasing your maximum life meant it became harder and harder and harder to reach 100% fortify, the thing you need to benefit from your fortified status. Being able to fortify for your maximum health here also means that a lot of builds that struggled with even be able to fortify in the first place might be able to splash it in a little bit better. They also touch on Bone Prison here, so I'm going to scroll down to the bug changes, or maybe I won't even scroll down here. But Bone Prison previously had a bug that when it applied vulnerable, it also procced Lucky Hit. They have fixed that. So you're not going to see these Mendeln builds triggering the Mendeln proc multiple times off of a single Bone Prison and being able to put out a huge amount of damage. This, at least for me, wasn't a huge problem because I had already shown that you can make an effective Mendeln build without abusing Bone Prison. But what it does mean is that like completely busted, broken mechanic at the very least on paper is supposed to be fixed. I don't know why this is a sub-bullet of Bone Prison, but Decompose now creates corpses every 1.5 seconds, now making it officially better at generating corpses than Reap if you're able to stand still in channel. This finally gives Decompose like some reason to be used for corpse explosion builds, for builds that are looking to spam summons like bone mages, etc. I'm going to be working through a decomposed build just based off of the powers that are available in Season 2, just to give it its fair shake. I still don't think that's going to be good enough, but at least here it's now differentiated from Reap, which was just pound for pound a better skill to be using 95% of the time. A pretty huge change to just how companions and minions in the game work in general. We previously had Death's Defense, which said that if you maxed it out, it would take 4 attacks to kill your minions, regardless of how much damage that it dealt. They could only do a maximum of 30% of their life, so it would go 30, 60, 90, and then dead. This is now just how minions work. They have this inherent structure to their overall survivability, and then everything else will just go forward to increasing the number of hits required for them to die. Because this is being taken out of the Necromancer tree. It's being replaced with increasing their percentage armor and their percentage resistance to all elements. You'll see a lot of changes later on where basically everything that targeted one summon will now just apply to all of your minions. So you're not pigeonholing yourself across multiple glyphs just to be able to get comparable bonuses to each one of your individual minions. So I'm really excited for that change. I'm going to go ahead and claim credit for this change. I know that is wildly, very ego-driven of me, but I pointed out with the video that the skill Terror, this passive, only worked for darkness skills and not for shadow damage, which meant that it literally didn't work for Shadow Blight, the biggest consistent source of damage on every single shadow build. They made it so that Terror now applies to shadow damage and also made it better. So it now triggers if a monster is chilled for the first bonus, and it also triggers if the monster is frozen for the second bonus. Following in the same system of all the other changes, Drain Vitality whenever you hit something with a blood skill now will fortify for maximum life. Necrotic Carapace whenever a skill says it creates a corpse, that will also fortify for maximum life. Rathma's Vigor sees a very big change, and it's a little bit hard to exactly understand what it says, but I'm going to try to do the math for you to just kind of show it off. First off, what it previously did was it just gave you maximum life, and then after 12 seconds of being healthy, you would overpower in your next blood skill. Now what it says is that after being healthy for 12 seconds, your next blood skill overpowers. So similar to before, the timer is reduced each time a blood orb heals you or overheals you for an amount greater than or equal to your base life. Or my first read through of this was that if a blood orb could successfully heal you for your base life, so if you were to go look at my character, my base life at level 100 is 8,000. If I could ever get a blood orb to heal me for 8,000 life, it would reduce my overpower, which would mean that it literally has a maximum level and gear requirement before it ever triggers at all. And now that I've looked at it more, it has to be an aggregate. It has to be that it adds up to healing from blood orbs. And every time you cycle past, your base life of 8,000 in healing or overhealing, it'll reduce the overpower. Meaning that stats that say that blood orbs heal for more, increase the healing that you receive, etc., are now part of the kit of overpower builds. And blood orbs are now required for the kit of overpower builds to be able to pump out more overpowers. But let's say I fully invest into like overhealing and things that increase my healing received, like on pants and blood orbs healing for more in the Paragon nodes. Let's say it only takes me like 2 or 3 blood orbs to overheal more than my base life. And then that reduces my cooldown. Maybe you're getting Rathma's overpower every 6 seconds, maybe even every 4 seconds. So the amount of overpowers that blood builds are able to churn out if they can successfully harvest enough blood orbs and enough bonus to their healing, which also goes hand in hand with the aspect Untimely Death, which is incredibly strong, that says when you overheal, increase your overpower damage bonus, which we're going to have to see how this kind of works with the new overpower, which again, we'll cover in a whole breakdown. But there's a very real world where you're overpowering like every 2 or 3 casts of Blood Lance, every 3 or 4 casts of Blood Surge, which is a pretty marked improvement in your overall ability to overpower and makes it a much more reliable damage bucket, similar to crit, similar to vulnerable. Shadow Blight, on the other hand, I think has become weaker, which is kind of interesting. What it used to do is it gave you a 1.1 multiplier, so a 10% damage bonus just for having Shadow Blight up. And then every 10th time that it triggered, it dealt 22% shadow damage. This would be increased by your shadow damage, it would be increased by your all damage, it would be increased by your global multipliers, etc. What it now says is that, so it still does the base thing of doing 22% damage every 10 times you apply Shadow Blight, but Shadow Blight's damage is increased by 100% of your shadow damage over time bonus. Okay, I get it. I'm a shadow build, I've been building into a ton of shadow damage over time, but that doesn't increase my Shadow Blight damage. This allows me to apply my shadow damage over time to my Shadow Blight proc damage. Seems like a win-win. It allows me to incorporate shadow damage over time into my build. How much shadow damage over time do you realistically get on a build though? So first off, let's just go look at Paragon. Like just very quickly, let's go look at Paragon and let's go look at the Wither board. The Wither board is a very powerful will board. The reason why that's so important We have Darkness, a will-based glyph that increases your shadow damage by 10% for every 5 willpower. Or Scourge, which increases your shadow damage over time by 10% for every 5 willpower. Do you see the problem here? Darkness increases all of your shadow damage. Scourge only increases your shadow damage over time. Now, obviously, they have different bonuses after that. One gives damage reduction, one gives shadow damage. But if this one does all shadow damage, which applies equally to shadow damage over time and instantaneous damage, and this one only applies to shadow damage over time, it's literally not worth it to include it. Now let's look at shadow damage on weapons. So instead of intelligence here, let's go ahead and type in shadow damage. You can't get shadow damage over time, and you can't get shadow damage on weapons. You can only get damage to affected by shadow damage over time, which does not change anything. This already worked with Shadow Blight, and it doesn't work now better with Shadow Blight. Let's look at the gloves. Let's look at shadow damage here. You can get shadow damage over time on your gloves, where you can't get shadow damage. So now, if I'm willing to take off either crit chance or attack speed or plus to skill ranks or lucky hit chance, I can put shadow damage over time here, which will now add to Shadow Blight. That's pretty good. That's 30% additive damage there. Let's look at shadow damage on rings. There is no shadow damage over time. There's only shadow damage and affected by shadow damage over time, so you can't get it there. Let's look at the chest piece. There's, again, only shadow damage. So other than in the Paragon tree of Lingering Shadows, which gives you shadow damage over time, and magic nodes, which give you shadow damage over time, these also already granted you shadow damage. So you were already picking them up, so it actually doesn't change what you do here. You're getting a very small amount of bonus shadow damage over time, which will now apply to Shadow Blight, which it previously didn't. But I think this is just worse. Like, legitimately, I don't really know a build that truly prioritized shadow damage over time as opposed to just shadow damage, if you ever even actually picked up shadow damage. And shadow damage already increased Shadow Blight's damage by an additive bonus. So what they did was they took away our 10% damage multiplier just from having Shadow Blight up, and then gave us a bonus that I think realistically doesn't do anything. So I actually think that this is just a nerf. It's gonna take some testing. I might just be wrong here, but this is just, like, I think strictly worse, and I don't know why it happened, because it looks like it should be a buff. Transfusion sees a very large change in its overall functionality. First off, remember how blood orbs now just heal your minions? That's what Transfusion used to do. It was a completely useless investment of skills. They've taken that away. Transfusion now says lucky hit chance to spawn a blood orb with a blood skill, something that the blood skills couldn't do. Bloodlance would generate a blood orb when it overpowered from its auto cast overpower from casting it 8 times. The blood skills had no ways of generating blood orbs except from Corpse Tendrils, a non-blood skill, and Blood Wave, a skill that ultimately was very bad. So now you just have lucky hit chance to spawn a blood orb, which means that you get to overheal for Wrath of Misc Vigor, means that you get to overheal for Untimely Death. It means that you get to use blood orbs, increase your damage by picking them up. So now we actually have a proactive way of generating blood orbs. It can only occur once every 4 seconds, which I think is completely valid. Every single blood skill deals damage to multiple targets and could trigger lucky hit multiple times. So this is absolutely a restriction that needed to be put in place. But similar to Hued Flesh generating corpses, it's doubled on bosses. So you have an 18% chance to generate a blood orb against a boss, and this can happen once every 4 seconds. So this can just help builds to be able to continuously churn out more blood orbs than they did previously, to be able to benefit from the changes to Wrath of Misc Vigor. And I think this is an incredibly smart change, and I'm really excited to play around with just how impactful this is. Similar to what I was talking about before, Gruesome Mending no longer has this weird caveat of if you're below 50% life, you get additional healing, another skill that was completely useless to take. Now it just says you receive more healing from all sources, increasing how much your blood orbs heal for, increasing how quickly you're able to proc Wrath of Misc Vigor, reducing cooldowns on the automatic overpower. Similarly, this increases the effectiveness again of Untimely Death and Temerity, the thing that says that when you overheal, generate Barrier. So this is a huge change in general, and while it may not see a lot of use outside of blood builds at all, it's at least there for survivability for other builds. Maybe you're on hardcore and you want your potions to be more effective. You can just drop 3 skills into here and boom, you heal for 30% more without any additional caveats. Another really good change. Inspiring Leader now triggers 2 seconds faster. So after being healthy for 2 seconds, it triggers, gaining attack speed for you and gaining attack speed for your minions. Ossified Essence though, this is a pretty big, it's pretty big. And let's just go ahead and talk about it. Ossified Essence has had its bonus cut in half. So if you don't personally know Ossified Essence, or if you're just a Bone Spare Necromancer who's never read your skills, Ossified Essence said every single essence that you have above 50 gives you 1% damage multiplier. So if we look at this character, which I currently have, and we go to my maximum essence, I currently have 175 maximum essence. That means that I gain 125 bonus multiplicative damage. That was bananas. This gave me 10% multiplicative damage. This gave me 125% multiplicative damage without having max rolls, without having bone graft, without having an elixir active. The elixir just said an additional 50% multiplicative damage. It was absolutely nutty how powerful this key passive was. It's been cut in half. So now rather than getting 125% free multiplicative damage just for clicking one skill, I instead am only going to gain 62.5 multiplicative damage. Still a little bit too simple. I kind of wish that the key passive was just reworked in some way because it's not really interactive. Once you figure out the puzzle of just having max essence all the time, it just says gain close to 100% multiplicative damage. Now it's closer to gain roughly 75 to maybe 90-ish multiplicative damage on the higher end, and more often just being around like the 50 to 60 range. So it's not really interactive in any way. I'd love to see it reworked. Okie dokie. Book of the Dead part, just to like sum it all up, basically every single thing just does more damage just across the board. Skirmishers now do more damage. Defenders now do more damage. Your sacrifices for the skeletal warriors now give you all resistance, and it's just a larger amount. Golems do double their base attack damage. Blood golems get a huge buff to their active damage ability. Iron golems get a huge buff, but a slightly smaller huge buff to their active damage ability. Oh, and you know what? Here we go. We get a little bit of our answer. The raised skeleton buff. There we go. All right, now this makes sense. The raised skeleton buff now lasts for 8 seconds. So that's why they had to change Bonded in Essence, because it was almost certainly they didn't actually mean to even nerf this. It's just how the functionality works with raised skeleton. So that's actually kind of funny. But you're going to have the buff up for longer, so you're not going to have to click raised skeleton as much. And then they also nerfed the Bone Mage sacrifice to overpower damage, which probably makes sense since overpower rework, which we're going to cover, is actually pretty powerful in comparison to the other damage buckets, because they needed to keep a lot of the identity of the bonus from maximum life and fortify, while simultaneously understanding that it is just harder to overpower than it is to apply vulnerable or crit damage. There are so many Paragon changes for your summons. I'm not going to go over all of them. Basically, what you need to understand is everything that used to just say skeletal mage or skeletal warrior or golem has basically now been changed to minion. So now Mage Paragon glyph says minions gain elemental resistance as opposed to just your skeleton mages gain elemental resistance. While the base thing still increases mage damage in particular, the additive or the additional bonuses are now all across the board as opposed to also specific. So armor for everything is increased, resistances for everything increased, minion resistances as opposed to golem resistances. They've increased the damage from the Hulking Monstrosity legendary node. The rare nodes have been increased in the damage bonuses that they give. So just across the board, minions do more damage. They're empowered better in the Paragon boards. They give more ubiquitous bonuses to all of your summons as opposed to just one in particular. And the ones that do particular stuff are also stronger. Walking into Corporeal Glyph. This is a glyph you may have literally never used, because the only thing that it did was increase armor values in nodes around it. This no longer has anything to deal with physical damage or resistances, and instead is just a magic node booster. So this joins things like Amplify and Blood Drinker as another alternative. The cool part though is that Corporeal says increase your physical damage by 10%. So now it's a magic node glyph bonus that also does physical damage increase, which can be used for a lot of different builds as a cool additional multiplier. The Wither legendary node will now show you the values that you have and you won't have to calculate it yourself, which is pretty dope. They also changed it so that the Wither node now works off of intelligence rather than willpower. So let's go ahead and look at that really quickly. The legendary node said shadow damage overtime effects have a chance to deal bonus damage, and that chance is increased, and both of these numbers are based off of willpower. Willpower, a stat that is basically completely useless for every single shadow build, because most shadow builds can manage near perpetual essence, so increasing your essence regen doesn't really matter. You also don't really need to like heal very efficiently on shadow builds. That's really a blood thing. So this working off of intelligence means that it now scales off of our strongest stat. So we're able to more easily prioritize that stat across the board to get a bigger bonus to the base skill damage and also increase your chances of doubling up your, or effectively critting on your damage over time. Just making shadow builds across the board pretty significantly stronger if they actually dealt shadow damage over time. So if you're actually using Corpse Explosion, if you're actually using Ultimate Shadow for either Blood Wave or Bone Storm, etc. Bloodbath used to say that attacks that are guaranteed to overpower increase overpower damage. They've slightly reduced the bonus from 50 down to 35, but it now says if you overpower, you deal additional overpower damage, which means the 3% chance to overpower that every character just has naturally wasn't getting screwed any longer. That will also see an overpower damage increase. They also nerfed Bone Graft. I don't think they had to go this far, quite honestly, because Bone Graft was already kind of difficult to manage unless you had Bone Storm up all the time. But they're going to reduce the maximum amount of essence from Bone Graft from 3 to 2 per stack, meaning that instead of getting 24 essence, you can only get 16 essence. Another huge change for shadow builds is that both the Darkness Glyph and the Scourge Glyph, which I talked about earlier, are now going to scale off of intelligence rather than willpower. The reason why this is so important is because the majority of boards didn't have incredibly strong willpower. Like 49 is typically the core stat highest bonus that you can get. Whereas obviously here for intelligence, you could get a total of 65. So now both of those glyphs can be put into different boards if they want to, or even in this board, actually gain more bonus than they did previously. It does mean that you need more Paragon points to max them out, but it basically just says by investing more in them than you did previously, you get more of a bonus out of them. So that's also a pretty huge change for shadow builds. It's just like getting outside of this weird willpower sub-genre that they existed inside of that did nothing for their damage at all. Okay, we're gonna try to rapid fire through some of these. Not all of them have like major implications, but basically because they've changed how damage reduction is gonna work, with armor no longer also applying to resistances, so people needing to find alternative ways of increasing their effective health. Blood Arson's Curse used to have total armor, it now has maximum life. Maximum life works regardless of resistance type, so that's probably better. Deathless Visage no longer has total armor, but instead has straight up damage reduction, which I think is just strictly better. And then on top of that, what's kind of interesting is that the echoes that they leave behind, the little explosions that would happen, now deal bonus damage for every 30% of critical strike bonus damage that you have. So crit builds like Bone Spear are still going to build into 100% chance to crit and additive crit damage. And after you understand like the implications of that, what it basically means is that synergies are starting to be implemented into the game in ways that are not necessarily directly intuitive or directly linked, but if you are willing to build it out, you're going to get a lot more out of it. So now if I still have like 300 crit damage, that means that I'm going to gain a 50% damage multiplier on the explosive damage from this unique aspect. Bloodless Scream. Now, just very quickly off the top, I still don't think that this makes it good enough, but they've changed a lot of really good stuff here. One, it used to have damage to frozen enemies. That's replaced with intelligence. This is going to scale your base damage multiplier, which is obviously a lot stronger than having a very niche additive damage bonus. The chill amount for darkness skills goes from 40% to 100%, which means that you can now much more effectively actually freeze enemies with Bloodless Scream, which is something that was kind of hard to do previously. And then the unique power finally has a damage multiplier on it. The unique power says right now that you have 100% lucky hit chance, and I can just show you very quickly, of generating essence. Again, a thing that darkness builds just really don't need, really ever, against frozen targets. What it also says now is that darkness skills deal a multiplier bonus damage against frozen enemies. So you're not as punished for using this item and losing that huge damage multiplier that you would typically put on a two-handed weapon, to be able to build into this kind of chilled frozen freeze necro type of build and then actually get a damage multiplier out of it. I still don't think that's like really good enough, because I'd rather just have a two-handed sword with crit damage and like a double bonus on a damage multiplier, but it's getting better. And if we ever get to a world where I need to be able to generate that much essence that quickly on a build that wants to do shadow damage and wants to freeze targets, now this unique is kind of there. It's kind of there, TM. That Speaker Pendant summoning skill damage was increased by 100%. That's huge. It just doubled now what it was previously. And the overpower damage affix was replaced with essence cost reduction. This was super important because blood builds, especially Blood Surge, which has the highest base cost of essence across the board of any core skill for the Necromancer, desperately needed essence cost reduction, and you were super penalized for using this amulet on that build. So now you actually have that, and that's pretty good. And on top of that, they also increase the base damage of the Nova. I'll be interested to see if the Novas still apply your overpower damage, which is really where your bread and butter was as far as damage was concerned here, and it'll be interesting. Also, that damage equation is probably going to look a lot different since it's now just a multiplier as opposed to like this big max life bonus thing. Overpower in general obviously is like very different, but it'll be interesting to see how it now works with Death Speaker's Pendant and whether or not that functionality is different at all. Here is probably my most favorite change across the board. Black River was a famously terrible weapon because it said intelligence, damage to distant enemies, which were typically in close range, damage to healthy enemies, which is like kind of okay, but that's what you need for one-shot potential, not for damage over time builds, which typically need just like good bonus damage. And then a single rank to Fueled by Death, which gave you 3% damage multiplier. And famously, its Corpse Explosion having a larger radius was bugged for Blighted Corpse Explosion. I'm not sure if they fixed that. I don't see it in the patch notes. We'll have to wait to see that. But now what it says is that damage to healthy enemies has been replaced with bonus to corpse skills that can get all the way up to 4. So normally you can only get +3 up to a skill bonus. Now this will be able to get up to +4 to all skill. So this weapon now says +4 to corpse explosion and +4 to corpse tendrils, which is really powerful. And then the damage to distant enemies was replaced with bonus ranks to hewed flesh, the % chance to generate corpses. The big problem with Black River is that it ate so many corpses that you lost out on procs of hewed flesh, and if I can increase the relative chance of me generating corpses, I'm more likely to be able to generate enough corpses to be able to use Black River to its biggest extent. So while I'm not 100% sure that this all of a sudden makes Black River like meta, it absolutely makes it actually viable and potentially meta defining. We'll have to play around with it. I have so many builds that we're going to need to be able to test at the beginning of season 2. But this is definitely the one that I'm looking out for the most. So I'm definitely going to be target farming this and immediately swapping over to a shadow build and see if we can actually make this ding dang thing work. Lidless Wall has maximum life on it now as opposed to damage to distant enemies, making it a better survivability tool on top of the fact that shields now have armor. But on top of that, it means that it can actually be used on overpower builds, which previously needed to use a shield to get maximum life in that slot. And since Lidless Wall didn't have it, they lost a huge amount of their overall power output. And now it has it, so it can be used on literally every single build just to win across the board. And then interestingly here, Ring of Mendel no longer requires 7 minions to be active. So if you're unwilling to invest in bonus minions, or if you're just trying to use like Reapers to generate corpses, but you still want to sacrifice your mages, you can still use Ring of Mendel, which kind of opens it up as a bit of a hybrid build in for a lot of different builds. I'm actually thinking about a lot of different blood builds that would use minions just for the utility of them. That might be getting a little bit more damage, or maybe I can splash in Ring of Mendel, which has like kind of okay stats on it. It's interesting to think about what this opens up. This was something that they were already supposed to fix, but was bugged. So hulking aspect is no longer going to be a resource aspect and instead a utility aspect. So it shouldn't be on rings anymore, meaning that we're more likely to get the much more important resource ring aspects. The title aspect has its damage increased. So this would reduce the damage of your multiple blood waves. It's now reduced by less, so that is a buff. Empowering Reaper has been buffed as well to do even more damage when the Blight is triggered off of it. Still not good enough to use, but literally better since you can get it in the Codex of Power. Hardened Bones also doesn't require 7 minions. The reason why this is so important, whereas like not building into less minions, but if any of your minions died and you were just at the 7 minion total required, they would all lose damage reduction, meaning that once one died, they were all more likely to die. Here, even if they die, they don't become more likely to die, so you're not punished for not perpetually having your maximum minions out. Reanimation, which was another skeleton-specific aspect, now also applies to your golem, so it just applies to all minions. Coldbringer aspect, meaning that your cold mages could cast Blizzard, now just works for every single mage, so all of your mages can cast Blizzard, so now your shadow mages can cast Blizzard to be able to generate a lot more CC, and the chilled and frozen status on creatures so that you can use maybe your shadow minions with your shadow build, with Bloodless Scream, and Frostburn, and now you're actually like a cold shadow. You see my hands doing this? I don't think it's real, but it's cool that it exists, and it's a niche build, and I like that they're increasing the meme build potential, right? Just literally making it more accessible. And then Potent Blood used to say while you're at full life, your blood orbs grant 20 essence, and now they just say while you're healthy. So that's all the way down to 80% of your life. So you don't need to be at max life to get the bonus. You can more proactively get the bonus essence from blood orbs. I think if you want to like kind of walk away with a couple things here, bone has been nerfed a bit. Blood builds are just in general going to be online a lot more often, a lot more functional, and with the changes to overpower are going to be a lot more intuitive to build. So we can completely ignore my old overpower video and post about how it worked. Now it's just another additive bucket. And then shadow builds have been given some tools for additional more damage. They're able to prioritize better stats. They're going to be just stronger in general than they were before. And especially with the reduction in crit damage bonus and vulnerable damage bonus, damage over time builds are now comparatively a lot more stronger than they were before. That doesn't necessarily change how they feel in combat, but it changes how the players' interpretation of their impact in combat versus other builds is going to feel. So it's literally just going to feel like less FOMO and more fun to be playing builds, since they're all going to be comparatively a lot more similar in strength. So there you go. There's your quick rundown. I hope that this helps contextualize like all of the changes coming to the Necromancer. Obviously, there is a ton in these patch notes. There's a ton coming in season 2. We haven't even finished my list about which vampiric powers to use per build. I'll get this one done as soon as I possibly can and get this one out to you as well. But again, thank you so much for watching this video. If you think that I missed anything, if I'm missing any nuance, if you think there's any synergies that I didn't quite notice, please let me know down in the comments. There's only so much that my brain can, sit here and digest at any given moment. So I almost certainly missed something. But again, thank you so much for watching. I truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.